Good morning. Our story today is I have seen the Lord, Mary Magdalene, found in John chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. Mary Magdalene sat in the pre-dawn stillness before the flickering light of an oil lamp. The door to her left stood slightly ajar so that she could watch the horizon for the first streaks of gray. These first streaks would herald the end of the Sabbath and the dawn of a new day, the third day. Tradition held that until the third day the soul of the newly deceased hovered near the body, and it wasn't until it departed that decomposition began. Mary glanced at the still black horizon and wondered if Jesus' soul lingered near the garden tomb. Her heart longed to go to him before the dawn ushered in the new day and carried his spirit away, but the Sabbath forbade it. And so she would wait for the dawn that had not only freed her to go to the tomb, but also freed his soul to leave the earth's bounds. For the rabbis taught that God would never leave the just in anguish more than 3 days. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Hosea 6:2. My God, Mary moaned as she closed her eyes and tears began to run down her face. The cruel anguish Jesus endured on the cross still burned so vividly for her. She had witnessed every torturous strain against the nails, every gasp of breath, until he cried out and breathed his last. It not only seemed impossible that he was dead, but that he could die. How could he, who had given sight to the blind and raised Lazarus from the dead, be conquered by death? How could he, who had broken through the nightmare of Mary's own torment and delivered her from the grasp of 7 demons, be nailed to a cross by mere men? Blinking back the tears, she ran her fingers along the twine that secured the package of spices in her lap. Then, lifting her eyes again to check the horizon, she found it still cloaked with night. She turned her attention back to the package and lovingly smoothed the creases in the wrappings as more memories of that day pushed their way back into her mind. Mary had waited near the cross until they took the body down. To her amazement, 2 Jewish leaders, men of wealth, came to claim it, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. She and some of the other women followed them to the nearby garden tomb and watched from a distance as these prominent men and their attendants carried the body inside. According to the burial tradition, the body would be first laid on the stone table in the center chamber of the tomb and washed with warm water. Afterward, those preparing the body for burial would wrap the torso and each limb separately, layering the strips with a mix of aloe and myrrh. A separate linen cloth would be used to wrap the head, but on this day everything was done in haste because the Sabbath was quickly approaching. The women couldn't see how well the body was prepared from their vantage point, and they could not bear the thought of their Lord would be denied a proper burial. So just as they provided for his ministry out of their resources when he was living, they would now take the initiative to be sure he was honored in his death. As soon as the morning dawned, they would go to the tomb to offer him the only expression of adoration left to them. They would anoint his body with the aloes and myrrh. The women would anoint the body with spices in an attempt to simply mask decomposition. But Mary, she knew it could do nothing to slow it. Death had won, and now nothing would slow its ruthless march through his body until all was consumed. Her offering of spices represented both the depth of her adoration for Jesus and the absolute devastation of her hope. But it was all she had to offer him, so she and the other women would do what they could. Mary would go ahead of the others and arrange for the removal of the stone. Mary lifted her eyes to the door once again and saw that at last the horizon was tinted with the first hints of gray. She took a deep breath, lifted the burial spices from her lap, and then rose to extinguish the lamp in the niches on the wall. It was time. The bright moon above lit her way. Mary moved quickly and quietly through the deserted streets at the edge of the city. Her thoughts were focused on the task at hand, particularly the challenge of the stone. She hoped the gardener would perhaps have arrived for his morning duties and be willing to assist her. Soon she exited the city gate and drew near to the site of the crucifixion, Golgotha, the place of the skull. The metallic scent of blood still hung heavily in the air, and Mary purposely kept her eyes from the sight and quickened her pace to cover the remaining distance to the garden. When she arrived, she gratefully ducked beneath the graceful palms that flanked the entrance, and then paused for a moment to catch her breath. Fig trees sweetly scented the air. Last rays of moonlight peeked through the thin, silvery leaves of the olive trees and cast gentle glow over the pink and white blossoms of the almond trees. A heavy, serene silence blanketed the place. Mary took a deep breath and closed her eyes and held the burial spices tightly to her chest, mingling with the woodsy aroma with the sweetness of the garden. Her grief was as heavy as the stone that awaited her at the sepulchre door. Tears flowed down her cheeks as she slowly began to take the final steps down the worn path. A moment later she rounded the bend, and the tomb glowed white in the moonlight in front of her. But there was a dark gaping hole in the tomb's center where the stone should have been. Mary's heart began pounding, and roaring sound filled her ears. She dropped the burial spices to the ground and reached out to steady herself against the trunk of a nearby palm. Jesus was gone. There was no other reason for the removal of the stone. Someone had taken the body. "No!" Mary cried. She doubled over and gasped for air, and then she stood gazed in astonishment at the empty tomb for a moment longer before turning and running from the garden into the sleeping streets of Jerusalem. She had to tell Peter and John. Soon she was frantically knocking on the door of the home where the men were staying. A weary reply came from behind the locked door. "Who's there?" "It's me, Mary. Quickly, open the door." Mary heard the bolt slide in the lock, then the heavy wooden door opened, and Peter and John ushered her inside. She looked into their anxious faces. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him," Mary said, John 20, verse 2. Without a word, the two men turned and ran from the house in the direction of the garden tomb. Mary followed them into the street. She tried to keep up with them, but they were too fast for her, and soon they were out of sight. When she once again arrived at the garden, the sun had not quite risen. She was sure they were already at the tomb and hurried along the path to meet them. When she arrived at the grave, the two men had completed their inspection and were already walking away. Moonlight across their faces illuminated no answer, only bewilderment. There was nothing more for Peter and John to do. They slowly turned and walked back toward the garden entrance. A moment later, she was left alone in the stillness once again. As Mary stood before the gaping entrance of the tomb, a terrible torment of grief engulfed her soul. She wrapped her arms around her waist and turned her face to the sky as a deep, rending wail escaped her lips. Sobs shook her body as her knees gave way, and she fell face down into the dust. She wept until the ground beneath her was saturated with her tears. Weak from exhaustion, she struggled to her feet, and then just as the sky above her was lightening with the first hues of sunrise, Mary once again walked to the entrance of the tomb and bent down to look inside. In the dim light of the tomb, she saw two men wearing white, sitting where Jesus' body had been. One was at the head of the burial niche, and the other at the foot. "Woman, why are you crying?" They have taken my Lord away," Mary said, "and I don't know where they put him." Then she sensed someone standing behind her, and she turned around to look just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the branches of the trees overhead. Mary squinted into the glare as a man, whom she assumed was the gardener, addressed her. "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will get him." Mary's great love for Jesus convinced her in that moment that if she only knew where his body was, she could carry it safely alone. Her grief overcame her again, and she turned away from the man to weep against the wall of the tomb. And then he called her name. "Mary." Once, long ago, Jesus had called her name, breaking through the darkness of her oppression to set her free from the 7 demons that bound her. Now he broke through the hopelessness of her grief and despair. Mary might not have recognized his face, but she could never forget the sound of his voice, not when he called her name. "Rabboni!" she gasped, and threw herself at his feet. Mary laughed through her tears as the scent of myrrh and aloes drifted up to her, and she realized the men must have anointed him for burial after all. But the efforts had been in vain, for the feet in her hands were warm and strong, alive. Then Jesus gently spoke again, and there was a smile in his voice. "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary relinquished her Savior's feet and ran to obey his command. The streets of Jerusalem were flooded with morning light as she reached John's home. She pounded on the door, and when John opened it, she burst inside to find the room filled with the disciples. They turned to her with stunned and weary faces, fearful of what news she might bring. But the news was miraculous and wonderful. The news of Hosea was true after all. After 2 days, he will revive us, and on the 3rd day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Hosea 6:2. Mary's face was dust and tear-streaked, but she beamed as she made the announcement, "I have seen the Lord." My risen Savior, there are times when the turmoil in my mind and heart blinds me to your comfort and glory, which are never near. I am so thankful that the meagerness of my faith doesn't hinder your nearness to me. You come to me in compassion, drawn by my love for you and need of you. Let the light of your morning break through the darkness of my grief, doubt, and despair. Whisper my name once again, my Savior, and still my soul. Thank you for listening, and I hope you had a wonderful Easter.